Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Redford, and this is the follow-up. Coming up on tonight's show, it's all about the economy. What's the impact of the Trump tariffs? What's the latest on inflation and interest rates? What about the ongoing shutdown of the federal government and Michigan's new state budget? We have two economists in studio tonight with some answers. But first, we would like to hear from you, our viewers, to help drive the conversation here in the follow-up. You can do that in a variety of ways via social media on Facebook. You can email us. You can dial into our follow-up hotline to voice your opinion or suggest future show topics. And if you'd like to watch any of our past shows this season, just log on to deltapublicmedia.org. Our guests tonight, two good friends, Chris Douglas. He's an economics professor at the University of Michigan-Flint. Nice to see you again, Chris. And Shay Manawar, he's with the Lansing Economic Development Corporation. He is a policy analyst. Good to see you both. You teamed up pretty well the last time, so let's do it again. Let's just start with Trump's tariffs. He's leveled tariffs in other countries anywhere from 10% to over 100% to level the playing field as he wants to do. He contends the U.S. is getting its fair share, treated right globally. Is he right about that? Are these tariffs working? Are they not working? Chris, I'll start with you. What's your view on this?
So there's a real myth that tariffs are good for American industry because it protects industry from foreign competition, but the stock market declining by nearly 1,000 points after the tariffs against China were announced really puts that myth to rest, in that tariffs are very detrimental to American industry for a couple of reasons. First, when you look at what's imported to the United States, if you look at like a top 10 list of imports, very few final consumer goods are on that list. There's like toys, clothing, furniture, but that's kind of it. Most of the imports are things like raw materials, chemicals, energy products, things American industry uses to make stuff in the United States. So what a tariff does is it raises the cost for industry, and either that causes industry to lose profit or it passes that cost on to consumers through a higher price. The problem with that is that consumers are already racked with the 40-year high inflation post-pandemic. So at some point the consumer is going to be kind of tapped out in terms of how many more price increases they can take, which means that if you're a company facing higher costs due to tariffs, you might be eating that in the form of lower profits for the short to medium run.
Shay, what's sort of the trickle down locally or statewide? When I think about Michigan, its ties to the auto industry, clearly there's got to be some impact there, but what are you thinking in terms of the trickle down here?
Well, absolutely. I mean, something that Dr. Douglas mentioned, alluded to, I mean, the impact of the overall tariff policy. I mean, when we were on the show a few months back, we highlighted that most of the projections are suggesting that the impact would be negative. It would be negative on the industry, it could be negative on the consumer side, it could even be negative on the job market side. In the recent past months, there are enough reports that suggest that yes, those projections were true. However, when it comes to look at the entire policy of Trump's administration, that packaged tariffs as part of it was not just about tariffs and its impact. It was also about how potentially it could have a positive impact down the road. And I think that's where we do have to not judge the impact of the tariff policy in a short term. We also have to look at the impact on the long term. Now, the long term could be a gamble. For instance, one of the stated objectives of the policy is that just by doing so, we could encourage some of the foreign or global markets to invest more in the U.S. Economy. That's one. Two,
Sure.
If that happens, it will lead to more economic development. That's B. And C, if that happens, it will lead to more economic benefits for an average American. The
Right.
first one, I mean, I won't be able to judge on how the global powers or other neighbors are reacting to it, but the B and C, which is the development and its benefits, it's something we need to evaluate in the long run.
Right.
Economic development overall, and if we package, or if we kind of look at from tariffs perspective, it would take years and years before we know if it's going to lead towards more economic development, because at the end of the day, it's not just a federal policy.
Right.
It's a trickle-down impact. That's when you have state government gets involved, that you have local jurisdiction who have role to play. So it could take much longer, but then as Dr. Douglas pointed out, the short-term impact is obvious and it's out there.
Yeah, that's the American public. We're very impatient. We want a quick fix to everything. We want some overnight changes. I mean, the president wants to see more American companies pull some of their products that they're maybe manufacturing abroad, bring them here. Again, not so easy. You can't flip a switch and change that. So it is going to take some time, right? Let's move on to the inflation story, the tariffs connection to inflation. You know, what kind of impact the tariffs had on inflation, since our inflation numbers are a bit higher compared to a year ago at this time. You look at some numbers, you can see them on the screen. Inflation rates, 3 out of the past 4 months have risen, 2.9% now inflation rate compared to about 2.7% last year at the same time. Any thoughts on where we're going with this inflation story?
So I think the tariffs have contributed to higher prices, which might be reflected in that tick up in the inflation rate. But I think the underlying reason for the inflation is the massive amount of government spending, especially post-pandemic, because during the pandemic, you saw a big uptick in government spending through the COVID stimulus. And sure, government spending has come down from those highs, but is still very elevated compared to where it was before the pandemic. So what that means is there's a nearly $2 trillion budget deficit during a strong economy, which is very unprecedented. And that's being financed by the Federal Reserve creating additional money. It's continuing to expand the money supply. So that's just the textbook recipe for inflation. So until government spending gets under control, until the budget deficit gets under control, I would expect inflation to run hot. And that puts the Federal Reserve in a dilemma, because with inflation being 3%, that's still 1 percentage point above the Federal Reserve's 2% target, and that's been the target basically since the early 1980s, when Paul Volcker famously broke the back of inflation. So if inflation continuing to run above target, the Federal Reserve should be raising interest rates. But what they did is they cut interest rates by 1/4 point during their last meeting, and then signaled potentially 2 more rate cuts during the rest of the year, which is really the opposite of what they should be doing. So what makes me wonder is that the Federal Reserve is at a dilemma. The tariffs are causing economic weakness in American manufacturing, weakness in employment. When the economy starts to weaken, the Federal Reserve wants to cut rates to try to stimulate the economy, while at the same time inflation is running high, which means the Federal Reserve should be raising rates. So they can't fight inflation and economic weakness at the same time. They have to pick their battle, and it looks like they're kind of picking the economic weakness battle, cutting rates at the expense of inflation continuing to run high.
I don't know if you want to follow up on that in terms of back to the trickle down. How's that affecting, you know, everyday Americans here?
Well, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
A couple of indicators Professor alluded to. One of them is unemployment, and the other could be, I mean, one great example could be consumer sentiment index. That's something the University of Michigan publishes month after month. And it was obvious that basically the index, which is a reflection of how an average consumer is whether optimistic or pessimistic about their personal expenses and overall economy. And if the index is above 100, it's optimism. If it's below 100, there's a lot of skepticism. When we began the year, it was about 70. So there was a lot of skepticism around the tariffs period between March and early summer. It rock bottomed to 50. So there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of anxiety amongst consumers. Now, the same indicator at the peak of the pandemic was about 70. So there is a good indicator that average Joe, like all of us, I mean, are concerned about it. And last but not least, the unemployment. I mean, Michigan unemployment is still higher than the U.S. Average. And then if you look at the local economies, such as Bay City, Lansing, or Detroit, it's more lower. It's much lower than the state overall. So there are concerns, and tariffs could be a reflection of what's happening out there.
Glad you brought that up about consumer sentiment. I'm going to pull up that graphic again that I think we had it over here.
Okay.
This was CNBC survey, a poll that suggests higher income Americans have a much more positive outlook on our economy overall as compared to lower income or middle income Americans. You can see that graphic there. One was really 0 to 100, and the one I think ahead of that was 1 to 10. So as you look at that, it's not necessarily breaking news, right? As you think about that higher income Americans think a little bit more highly. They have a little bit more disposable income, right?
Yeah, if you look at the major economic issues post-pandemic, it's really inflation. I mean, that's what determined the outcome of the presidential election, because whenever there's inflation, voters blame, rightly or wrongly, the incumbent for it. So there's inflation, now we have tariffs, and that really hurts the lowest income Americans the hardest because they're the least able position to pay those higher prices. You know, if you're upper income, if you're making $500,000 a year, prices go up by 10% due to inflation coupled with tariffs, you can afford to pay that. But if you're a single mother, you have a few kids, you live a paycheck to paycheck and prices go up, you start thinking about, well, which meals do we miss? Which car repair don't I undertake? Do I skip a rent payment? So it's the higher prices I think are resulting in a lot of economic anxiety, especially on the lower end of the income distribution because they're in the least able position to pay it.
Yeah. You know, talking about the Federal Reserve, I want to go back to that again based on some of your points. That kind of what they're doing doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and I hate to get into politics here, but there is politics involved. You think they're knuckling into this sort of the pressure from the Trump administration that's been calling for that to cut those rates time and time again over months and months?
That's a possibility, although I think President Trump has made it clear he's not reappointing Jerome Powell to be the chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. So I think if Powell's in the running for another term, there might be some political pressure in that he wants to keep the president happy to get that reappointment. So there might be some politics. I think the Fed does have a history of not being politically independent, even though we like to think the Federal Reserve makes monetary policy decisions independent of political considerations. But like what we saw under the Nixon administration, under the Johnson administration, the Fed has caved to political pressure. So that's a possibility. But I think the Federal Reserve, like we were talking about earlier, faces a dilemma. We have potential economic weakness due to tariffs. We saw jobs numbers be really disappointing for September. Only 22,000 jobs were created. That's about 100,000 jobs short of what should be created. And job creation numbers for previous months were revised down. So that signals weakness, which would cause the Federal Reserve to cut rates. With inflation being high, the Federal Reserve should be raising rates. So we have this dilemma, weakness coupled with inflation. Which battle do you fight? And it looks like the Federal Reserve is going to fight the unemployment battle by cutting rates, even if it means higher inflation moving forward.
Can one of you guys define, just kind of explain a little bit, when the Federal Reserve cuts the federal fund rate, how does that affect sort of the mom and pop, buying a car, buying appliances, buying a mortgage on a house? How might that affect those rates? So who wants to touch that? Okay.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
So the federal funds rate, that's the rate banks pay when they borrow overnight from other banks. So it's the safest, shortest term loan in the economy. So if the federal funds rate falls, that becomes cheaper for banks to borrow, and then they pass on that savings to consumers in the form of like lower car loan rates, lower mortgage rates. It's just through market competition, because if the federal funds rate falls and one bank doesn't lower its rates, another bank will lower its to try to steal business. And it works in reverse too. When the Federal Reserve hikes the federal funds rate, again, that's the shortest, safest loan in the economy. So if the federal funds rate goes up, the only way banks will continue to lend to consumers, which are longer term, riskier loans, is if those rates rise as well.
All right, very good.
Yeah.
So I'm moving on to the federal government.
I do want to make
ahead.
one quick point. So my hope is that when we are evaluating the impact of tariffs, we just don't look at it from a macroeconomic or microeconomic. We also look at it from a community development perspective. So one example I'll quickly share is that the city where I live in, city of Lansing, it went through a significant amount of urban decay about 15, 20 years ago, right? The recession happened,
Sure.
GM plants closed. There were no tariffs back then. And there were households that have seen their middle income household incomes just dwindling to barely something they're able to afford, a home or a single car. I mean, they're still living there,
Sure.
right? So when I had a chance to meet with them and talk about a couple of economic development projects, their question was, tariffs and no tariffs, it's been 20 years, we have not been able to see economic activity that has impacted our ability to buy consumer products. So for instance, what they're saying is if the price goes up, right, which has been happening because of tariffs, they're still not able to purchase the same basket of items that,
Sure.
and sometime back they were still not able to purchase it because there were no jobs. So I think at some point we have to tie it down to the intended objectives of the overall policy. On the short term, yes, there are some hits that we have to take, good or bad. But if there is a decent translation towards robust economic development, and that's where I think there could be another layer of discussion. If that's happening, then we may have to evaluate tariffs from a different perspective. But if that's not happening, the economic development, then it's bad in the short term, it's bad in the long term.
Right. Well, it's been said for a lot of time with inflation, the current state of the economy, you've got let's say two people, mom and a pop, both working full-time jobs, got a couple of kids, cost of daycare is through the roof, and it's preventing a lot of them to buying their first-time homes, and that's been an issue that we're not able to solve. So it's back to kind of this discussion we're having with inflation and interest rates. It's pricing families right out of the game. Is that what you're talking about a little bit here?
Absolutely. And another indicator, I mean, the average transaction price of a new vehicle has gone up in the recent couple of months. It's about $50,000 right now. It has increased from about $46,000, $47,000 from the same period last year. It has gone up. However, if you look at the recent third quarter sales of the car manufacturers, it has increased. You have Big Three, their unit sales have increased in the third quarter between 5% to 8% when we compare with the same period last year. So at some point, if you go back to the same exhibit, that household earners or incomes at a certain level, they may still face the impact of the tariffs, but their ability to consume products has not diminished.
Sure.
But those who were struggling to begin with, without or with tariffs, I mean, they may be struggling in the past, but they may be struggling a bit more today. But the kind of economic activity they were foreseeing or been expecting for generations, it hasn't come.
Right.
Yeah, you touched on something a second ago about how young couples having a tough time being able to buy a house, and I think that's certainly true because housing prices still are at a record high level. Housing prices shot way up during the pandemic as a consequence of low interest rates and people wanting to move out of their cramped apartments in cities to get some breathing room when everyone was locked down. Being at a studio apartment in New York City feels pretty confining if you're locked down 24/7. So the demand for housing during the pandemic pushed prices way up. Usually when interest rates rise, housing prices come back down, but that hasn't happened this time. So if you're a young couple in your 20s trying to buy a house, you're looking at a record high price for a house and a 6.5% mortgage interest rate, up from under 3% just in 2020, which adds you $1,000 or so to the monthly payment, and a lot of people just simply can't afford that, which is why I think when you look at the statistics, you see a record number of people in their late 20s, early 30s still living at home, simply because housing is unaffordable. I mean, some of your viewers might remember the early 1980s when mortgage rates hit like 25%, and I've heard people say, well, you know, interest rates were high in the early 1980s and people still bought homes. What gives now? Well, housing prices were a lot lower in the early 1980s to offset that higher interest rate. But housing prices now have it corrected down. And I think a large part of that's because of supply issues. You go back to the last big recession we had, 2008, 2009, a lot of home builders just go bankrupt, never get back into the market. So when you look at new housing starts, they still haven't recovered to where they were back in 2006. So I think that reduction in supply of housing is preventing prices from adjusting down in the face of higher interest rates, which is really squeezing the consumer, especially the younger consumer trying to start a family.
Good point. It's interesting. Go ahead.
And just to add to it, one of the factors that at times we do not put a lot of spotlight on is local taxes, property taxes. I live in the city. It's much cheaper for me to move to a township, right? But we also need to look at the kind of housing demands that the younger population is expecting. I mean, we are kind of moving towards graduating from college or getting a job, moving to suburbs.
Sure.
Younger population still needs to live around cities. So there is a significant shortage of housing at the urban center level. But then when we look at those housing options, you also have to account for a significant amount of taxes. I mean, the local jurisdiction, I mean, the taxes are significantly higher at the city level because of many factors, including an aging infrastructure. The way the state the structure is set up is such that you have multiple townships surrounding the municipality, and there's not a lot of incentive for builders to go into the municipality for housing development. Hence, we will always see that friction as to are we able to create enough housing opportunities for the population that wants to live in a densely populated area. So that would be a policy issue for some time to come.
Sure. And that's not just a Lansing City issue, it's the Flint City issue. I know, Chris, you don't live in Flint, but you're right around it. Detroit, we're all feeling the brunt of that. And you mentioned home building. Just today, Trump leveled a tariff, I think 25% on home building products from abroad, on timber, kitchen cabinets, and already I heard some news reports of home builders saying, well, he's going to pass that cost along to the homeowners, not getting any easier for them.
Yeah, there's been studies done about the Trump tariffs in his first term, where he levied tariffs on things like washing machines imported from foreign countries. Those studies uniformly found that the cost of those tariffs were passed on to consumers via higher prices. So if there's a tariff on lumber, kitchen cabinets, things going into a new home, that's just going to add to the new price of a home, which, like we're talking about earlier, is already at a record high level.
So I want to touch on the federal government shutdown really quick. It's now day 14. How do you guys see this impacting the economy overall? Typically, Wall Street, Main Street doesn't do too well. If the shutdown runs too long, we're in it 2 weeks. Are you seeing any trickle down as yet? Are people talking about it, or is it sort of ho-hum right now, other than the fact this is government doing what government does, business as usual?
Yeah, at the administrative level, there is some potential impact. For instance, just today, we had some, around this time of the year, you have some year-end reporting that needs to be done. You have local partners, local economic development organizations work in tandem with the state and the federal level. So what happens is, because of the shutdown, amongst other consequences, just working government, which itself is slow to begin with, becomes further more inefficient. And I think that is something we cannot afford, especially when we have been going through quite a bit of economic uncertainties year after year. And inefficient government at this stage is something it's something we should not be foreseeing.
Yeah, I think the consumer hasn't noticed yet because the shutdown's only a couple weeks old, which means most federal workers haven't missed a paycheck yet. But if this thing drags out for another few weeks, we start getting a month plus into a shutdown, TSA workers might walk off the job, air traffic controllers might walk off the job because they're entitled to back pay once the government reopens. But that means that they might miss a paycheck in the meantime. If you're a TSA worker, maybe you say, well, I'm just going to go work for a different company, go work in an Amazon warehouse, or unemployment rate still is relatively low, so they could probably find a different job where their pay is not being delayed. So if people start walking off the job due to a lack of pay, well, then the consumer is going to notice an impact on the government shutdown when TSA lines are an hour plus long, flights are delayed due to a lack of air traffic controllers, national parks are closed because the rangers aren't being paid. So I think the government can exist for a couple of weeks when it's shut down, but if we start talking about months, I think it's a totally different story.
And we have seen such episodes happening quite frequently in the past, I would say 10, 15 years. I'm hoping this time around there's some mitigation, there's some planning that has been done on the back end to ensure that there's no disruption. Because next year it's midterm, so whatever happens today or in the coming weeks, it could impact both parties. So I think there's strong impetus on both ends to ensure that if there's some disruption, it's minimal. But as I mentioned earlier, when we look at from the administrative perspective, there are some delays, there are some uncertainties, and that leads to inefficiency. And an organization that we are hoping that becomes more refined from now onwards, we cannot afford further inefficiencies.
2018, 35 days, that was back in December. That was our longest government shutdown in recent memory, so hopefully that won't be the case this time. So I'm going to touch on one last thing before we go. State budget. That was sort of the focus of my show last week. They were supposed to have a budget July 1, didn't come up with one until 2 months later. But are there some line item budget items that you see from an economic development standpoint that maybe our viewers need to see and think about?
Yeah, of course. So a couple of things I want to highlight. First is I think it's one of the first time in many years, we had a divided government in Lansing. You have a Democratic governor, you had a Democratic Senate, and you have Republican House. An argument could be made that, you know what, at times when you have such a divided government, you may come across a compromise that may be better for an average Michigander. My personal opinion is that's true. Again, it went through quite a bit of an exercise in downtown Lansing, where I work in downtown, so I saw protests happening, especially on the marijuana tax. I saw, because I work at the economic development level, so I saw some anxiety over the funds being reallocated from economic development pool towards roads and other sections of the economy. So that happened. What is obvious is that there has been significant push towards reallocating some of the money that was geared towards the economic development, not towards road funding. Now, both is an integral part of our economy. It's just a matter of time if you're able to make it more efficient, if you're able to have heightened transparency around these allocations. I think it will be fruitful. Otherwise, come next legislative cycle, we will go back to square one.
May see a bump at the gas tax. I think they eliminated the motor fuel tax. A little bit of a shell game here, right?
Yeah, I mean, the gasoline in Michigan is subject to the sales tax, which is why gas is more expensive here than in Ohio. If you go to Cedar Point, gas is a lot cheaper once you cross the border. So they eliminated the sales tax on gasoline, but replaced it with an equivalent fuel tax. It's supposed to be offsetting, so you won't notice a difference at the pump.
Hopefully we see better roads. Go ahead.
And the biggest thing is, one argument that was made, I think it was through one of your friends you were talking about, is that a consumer would see how much a tax is levied when he or she goes at a pump, because that particular percent of their sale is directly going towards roads. So there is some idea, there's an idea out there that we would have much more control over where the money is going, but at the end of the day, it's a chronic issue that hasn't been solved over decades now. Maybe this time we'll be lucky, but it will still be a problem going forward.
Not a perfect solution, but at least they didn't shut the government down in this state as they did the federal government.
They did pass
so
at 3 in the morning
thing.
when everybody was sleeping.
Nice having you both on the show. Make a good team, and thanks a lot. Never enough time. That's our show tonight. Be sure to join us next week on the follow-up. What are the biggest challenges facing higher education and its impact on students and staff, from the cost to curriculum to culture on campus? That's next week, right here on the follow-up. Have a great night, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And make sure to click that bell icon to stay notified when we upload new content. Videos like this are only possible because of viewers like you. To help support this channel, click on the link in the description below. We'll see you next time.